They say every family has secrets, but some secrets are born twisted, hidden not out of shame, but out of survival. This story begins in a hollow where sunlight never truly reaches, deep in the Appalachian folds of West Virginia. It's said that if you listen long enough, you can still hear their voices, soft, broken, calling out to no one. What began as love ended as a curse that reshaped a bloodline. Long before cameras and gossip could expose them, a small cluster of families lived cut off from the world, tucked between steep ridges and winding rivers. They worked the same land their ancestors had, buried their dead in the same soil, and swore by God to keep outsiders away. But the truth is, they weren't just protecting their land, they were protecting each other, protecting the bond that bound them in ways the world was never meant to see. The first whispers came from travelers who got lost along the old dirt road leading into odd West Virginia. They'd return pale, muttering about children who didn't speak, faces that looked too much alike, eyes that followed from behind rusted screen doors. Locals told them to stay quiet, that's just the Whittaker place. But as years passed, curiosity turned to horror. Reporters, genealogists, and even police who stepped foot onto that property walked away changed, their minds heavy with something that couldn't be forgotten. To understand how it all began, you have to go back to a time before electricity, before the name Whittaker meant anything outside that hollow. The story starts with a woman named Gracie and her brother, John. Records say they were born to a poor mining family around the early 1900s, when West Virginia was split between coal dust and superstition. Their parents died young, leaving them alone, isolated, and dependent on each other for everything. Love, grief, protection, it all twisted together until no one could tell where one feeling ended and the other began. There were no schools, no churches, no doctors for miles, only the mountain and the two of them. It's said that in isolation, morality bends. What starts as love becomes hunger. What starts as loyalty becomes obsession. And by the time neighbors noticed, it was too late. Their children had already been born. What those children became is what people still whisper about today. They grew up feral half, hidden from sight, moving through the woods like ghosts. The people in town called them the family, as if speaking their name might invite the curse. But the truth was stranger than the myth. The family wasn't evil, and they weren't monsters. They were the result of something that should have never happened. An endless cycle of relatives marrying relatives, siblings loving siblings, each generation locking its doors tighter against the outside world. No one knows how many times the bloodline folded in on itself. 3 times, 6, more. Each generation looked more and more alike. Eyes too close together, skin pale from lack of sunlight, speech patterns that slipped into low, animalistic murmurs. And yet, there was something hauntingly human about them, a kind of fragile loyalty and innocence even, like they didn't understand what had been done to them. In the 1950s, a census worker stumbled onto the property while counting households. What he found made him sick. Children and adults sleeping in the same room, a single pot boiling something unrecognizable on the stove, and eyes, so many pairs of eyes, watching from the shadows. He filed a report, but the county buried it. You see, poverty wasn't new in Appalachia. Inbreeding wasn't unheard of either, but this was something else. By the 1980s, journalists began to dig. They traced the Whittaker family line through courthouse records, death certificates, marriage licenses. The truth emerged in fragments: cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, entire generations with no outside marriage recorded. When outsiders finally visited the property to document the family, cameras captured what words could not. One man barked like a dog, unable to form speech. Another stared into the lens with a look so lost it broke hearts. Behind them, A woman laughed softly, not at the visitors, but at something inside her own world. That video would go on to haunt millions. But back then, before the internet, it was passed quietly from journalist to journalist, as if those who saw it were unsure whether they'd witnessed tragedy or sin. Some said the family should be institutionalized. Others said they should be left alone, that they were victims of circumstance and history. But the deeper truth is uglier. This wasn't just a story of isolation. It was a story of control. Somewhere in the early 1900s, before records grew thin, someone in that family made a choice to keep the bloodline pure, to prevent their property from being split, to maintain a kind of divine legacy in their own eyes. The inbreeding didn't start by accident. It started by design. What began as poverty became a religion. Over time, the children who were born from that choice stopped leaving. They couldn't. The world outside didn't understand them, didn't want them. When one of them tried to move away in the 1970s, they were mocked, taunted, called freaks, until they vanished back into the hollow. The walls of that place weren't made of wood. They were made of shame. There's a story of a local preacher who tried to intervene. He brought food, clothes, even offered to relocate the younger ones. But after one visit, he never came back. His wife said he woke up screaming for weeks, muttering about the sound of laughter in the woods, about faces staring from the tree line. The town quietly stopped talking about the Whittakers again, as if silence could undo what had already been done. And yet, the bloodline survived. Through decades of poverty, ridicule, and darkness, they remained. Not because of stubbornness, but because love, even in its most distorted form, is hard to kill. They didn't see what they were doing as wrong. To them, it was protection, loyalty, a family bound so tightly together that even God himself couldn't separate them. That's the part most people can't face. The horror isn't in the deformity or the madness, it's in the love. The kind of love that refuses to die even when it should. The hollow where they lived became a place no one dared to visit after dark. Hunters avoided it. Kids dared each other to get close, only to run when they heard the barking. Locals said the air felt different there, heavier, like the ground itself remembered what happened. What's left today is something between myth and memory. The Whittakers are still there, or what remains of them. Some have passed on. Some live quietly, shielded by neighbors who both pity and protect them. Reporters still show up sometimes, drawn by curiosity or guilt. But those who look too deeply come away haunted, because when you stare into their eyes, you don't just see tragedy, you see reflection, because at its core, this isn't just a story about them, it's a story about us. About what happens when isolation festers, when love turns inward, when the human need for belonging eats itself alive. The Whittakers didn't create their curse alone. Society helped by looking away, by pretending the hills were empty. And the truth buried under those trees is this: they hid their love because they had to. Because if the world knew what it really looked like, it would have destroyed them long before the cameras did. The story of the Whittakers isn't about monsters in the hills. It's about how far the human heart will go to feel less alone, and that's a horror no one escapes. They say time softens memory, but in the hollow where the Whittakers lived, it did something darker. It preserved it. Every whispered word, every secret, every act folded into the next generation like a shadow that never left. By the time the 1960s rolled through the mountains, the family had grown in number and in secrecy, a web of relatives so entangled that even they sometimes struggled to remember who was who. To outsiders, it looked like decay. To them, it was normal, a twisted architecture of the human heart. Visitors were rare. When they did come, they were usually men or women who had grown up in nearby towns, drawn by rumors and whispers they didn't fully understand. Some came for work, some for curiosity, and some for the kind of thrill that only comes from trespassing into places you've been told to fear. The family watched these strangers like shadows themselves, observing from behind the screens of their sagging houses, measuring their intentions in silence. A glance too long or a question too sharp could mean a confrontation, but more often the strangers left without incident, carrying a lingering unease that never truly faded. Inside the family's walls, the rules were strict, unspoken but enforced in ways that were almost ritualistic. Each child knew their place, each adult knew their boundaries, and each relationship, no matter how unnatural to the world outside, was governed by a hierarchy older than anyone alive to explain it. Some claim that the family held council meetings, not in words but in gestures, glances, and subtle movements that outsiders could never decipher. What they were deciding is lost to history, but those who escaped said the weight in the air was almost tangible, like living under a permanent sentence you hadn't committed. And yet, there were moments of tenderness, rare but undeniable. In the dim light of oil lamps, siblings held each other close during storms. Parents, or the closest approximations they could muster, sang lullabies to children who would never see a schoolroom, never touch grass in a public park, never meet anyone who didn't share their blood. Those moments were fleeting, but they were real, and perhaps it was the reality of that love, the unyielding, inescapable bond, that made the rest of their lives so haunting. By the late 1970s, the world outside the hollow was changing rapidly, but the family remained frozen. Television, highways, and outside influence crept toward them, but it was as though the mountains themselves absorbed the progress, keeping the family in a bubble that was both protective and suffocating. When a social worker attempted to investigate after reports of neglected children, she was met not with anger but with resignation. The adults of the family did not defend their actions with words. They defended them with the solidity of their presence. They did not resist. They simply were, a living testament to the choices of generations past. The children who had been born into this world carried the weight of their ancestry in ways that outsiders could see but never fully comprehend. Faces were familiar, movements mirrored older cousins and uncles, and eyes often held a haunted intelligence that seemed out of place in such a remote, impoverished setting. Some children attempted escape, walking for miles into the nearest town only to be met with fear, suspicion, and sometimes outright violence. The mountains claimed them back, guiding them home with an inevitability that was almost supernatural. It was as though the land itself was enforcing the boundaries that the family had set for themselves decades earlier. Stories from the time speak of a teenage girl who tried to flee after realizing she was pregnant by her cousin. She vanished for 3 days only to return quietly, carrying the child in her arms, her expression a mixture of defiance and acceptance. The adults didn't punish her, they didn't scold her, they simply integrated the situation into the ongoing fabric of family life. There were no heroes, no villains, only the relentless persistence of a self-contained world. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Medical professionals eventually took notice in the 1980s. Genetic anomalies were rampant, compounded by generations of inbreeding. Malformations, mental disabilities, and rare diseases peppered the lineage. Doctors who dared examine the family were struck by the juxtaposition of resiliency and fragility. The same hands that were malformed could still work the land with skill. The same minds that were delayed could still recognize each other with an eerie understanding that defied explanation. And through it all, the family remained fiercely private, a closed system that absorbed outsiders' judgments like water into stone. Even law enforcement struggled with the Whittakers. Calls to the property were rare but intense, neighbors reporting barking, screams, or children wandering outside. When authorities arrived, they were met with a family that neither resisted nor cooperated. They did not speak much, but their presence was enough to unsettle anyone. Investigators would later describe the atmosphere as oppressively quiet, a weight that pressed down on them even as they tried to maintain control. They left quickly, unnerved, and sometimes they left quietly frightened. This is where the true horror begins, not in physical violence, not in crime, but in the psychological suffocation of a people trapped by circumstance, loyalty, and love. The Whittakers weren't evil, they weren't monsters. They were human beings forced into an unnatural pattern, each generation struggling to survive within the boundaries of choices made long before they existed. Every laugh, every cry, every whispered secret was a thread in a tapestry that outsiders could never fully understand. The town itself eventually accepted the family's existence with a kind of grim tolerance. They were tolerated, but never embraced. Children in school whispered about them. Adults crossed the street when they walked by, and the local stores avoided extending credit. Yet the family endured, resilient and stubborn. They were ghosts that refused to disappear, rooted in a land that had forgotten them long before anyone else ever knew their names. And even as decades passed, as modernity crept closer, there was a sense that the family was unchanging. Photographs from the 1990s and early 2000s show faces that seem almost timeless, as if age had no effect on them. Eyes remain haunting, gazes fixed in quiet observation. Laughter echoes in memory, a soft sound that is both comforting and terrifying. The Whittakers survived not because the world left them alone, but because they refused to leave themselves. This is the paradox of their existence, a family trapped by love and blood, by choice and by chance, surviving through cycles that outsiders would call madness. And the more we dig into their history, the more we see that inbreeding was not just a biological fact, it was a psychological one. Each generation internalized the patterns of the last, and each child was born into a system they neither created nor fully understood. By the turn of the century, researchers and amateur historians began to piece together the family tree. It was labyrinthine, impossible to follow without a map. Cousins, aunts, uncles, half-siblings, step-relatives. It was a web that defied standard logic. And yet, within that chaos, there was a sort of coherence. Rules existed that outsiders could not see, but the family understood intuitively. A child born in 1975 knew the same secrets as a child born in 2001. They carried history in their bodies, in their mannerisms, in their silence. The hollow became a living archive, a place where history, biology, and human emotion intertwined in ways that should have been impossible. It was a place that forced anyone who entered to confront the uncomfortable truth that love, even when pure in intention, can be corrupted by isolation and obsession, that sometimes protection becomes prison. That family can be both a sanctuary and a cage, and so the Whittakers endured. They hid their love not because they were ashamed of themselves, but because the world outside could not understand them. Each generation carried forward the weight of history, the burden of survival, and the haunting clarity of knowing that their choices, made long before they were born, would define them forever. By the early 2000s, the Whittakers had become a whispered legend, a cautionary tale passed from town to town. But what most people didn't realize is that legend only scratches the surface. The real story lives in the details, in the quiet moments that no outsider could witness without being swallowed by the oppressive gravity of the family's existence. The Whittakers' home, if it could even be called that, was a compound of decaying cabins, each one holding layers of secrets, each one a repository for generations of forbidden bonds. Walking through the area was like stepping into a time capsule built from neglect, love, and obsession. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with the lives of those who had come before. The adults of the family had long since internalized the rules that governed them. Discipline was not enforced through fear, it was enforced through expectation. Every child, every cousin, every sibling knew what they could and could not do. But there was something unnerving about it, a sense that the boundaries were alive, that stepping out of line would bring a punishment far beyond what the physical world could administer. Parents, biological or otherwise, watched their children with a quiet vigilance, their eyes tracking every movement, every glance, every hesitation. They were guardians of a bloodline that had survived against the odds, and their devotion was absolute. Education was minimal, delivered sporadically by whoever was deemed capable. Reading, writing, basic arithmetic. Everything else was learned through observation, through imitation, through living within the self-contained universe of the hollow. The children's intelligence varied wildly. Some were brilliant, absorbing knowledge like sponges. Others struggled, their cognitive abilities impaired by the repeated inbreeding that had woven through generations. Yet even those who struggled carried an uncanny, almost preternatural awareness of the family's dynamics, an instinctive understanding of how to survive within the system. Visitors occasionally attempted to breach the family's privacy. Curious historians, freelance journalists, even local law enforcement. Few returned with anything coherent to report. Those who did spoke of disorienting interiors, rooms cluttered with relics, photographs of family members whose faces all seemed to blur together, walls covered in calendars and handwritten lists tracking births, deaths, and marriages. One reporter described a sense of temporal distortion, a feeling that the house existed outside of time itself, that the same patterns repeated year after year with a precision that was both fascinating and horrifying. But it wasn't the interiors or the objects that unsettled people the most. It was the faces, the eyes, the way the family moved. Children who should have been toddlers would suddenly appear as young adults, their features unnervingly familiar. Adults seemed older or younger depending on the day, or perhaps depending on the visitor's perception. There was a rhythm to their lives that outsiders couldn't comprehend, a logic that existed only within the compound. And in their eyes, so many eyes, the world could glimpse both innocence and something darker, a deep, seated awareness of the cycle they were trapped within. By this point, genetic anomalies had become more pronounced. Facial deformities, skeletal irregularities, and mental delays were present in many family members. Yet, in the midst of what one might call deformity, there was a haunting symmetry. Brothers resembled sisters, uncles resembled nieces, grandchildren resembled grandparents. The repetition was almost artistic, grotesque in its precision, and while outsiders often recoiled, those within the family barely noticed. For them, the traits were markers of belonging, signs that the bloodline endured, signs that the family had survived where others might have faltered. Despite, or perhaps because of this, there were moments of startling normalcy. Family meals, small celebrations, even acts of quiet affection revealed a humanity that outsiders were rarely allowed to witness. When a child fell or cried, a sibling would comfort them. When someone became sick, relatives rallied in ways that outsiders might recognize as love. The paradox was clear. The same conditions that produced suffering also produced tenderness. That tenderness, however, was inseparable from the horror, inseparable from the cycle of inbreeding, obsession, and isolation that defined their existence. By the 2010s, with social media and modern connectivity creeping closer, the family's story began to leak more broadly. Amateur genealogists pieced together the family tree, and the repetition of names and faces became impossible to ignore. Some attempted to document the family, but the Whittakers were masters of avoidance. Cameras captured glimpses of movement, shadows crossing windows, faces half hidden behind curtains. Attempts to force entry were met with silence, or at worst, a quiet but unrelenting sense of being watched. Psychologists who studied similar isolated communities have long debated the effects of multi-generational inbreeding combined with intense social isolation. The Whittakers are a textbook example. Cognitive delays in some, heightened instinctual awareness in others, deeply ingrained loyalty to the family, and an almost ritualistic adherence to long-standing rules. They are a living, breathing demonstration of how human behavior adapts, or perhaps contorts, under extreme conditions. Yet in observing them, one cannot escape the moral ambiguity. The family is both victim and perpetrator, innocent and complicit, trapped in a cycle that began before their births and that will likely continue long after anyone outside could intervene. Stories from neighbors continue to surface. Accounts of late-night gatherings, children wandering alone in the moonlight, adults speaking in hushed tones at windows. One elderly woman recalled seeing 3 generations of the family standing silently along a ridge, staring toward the road, as if measuring who among the outsiders was worthy or dangerous. It's unclear whether they understood the significance of these moments themselves, or if they were simply following behaviors ingrained through decades of repetition. Either way, the image has persisted in local lore, a symbol of enduring secrecy and the unknowable weight of inherited love and trauma. And perhaps the most haunting aspect is the sense of inevitability. There is a rhythm to the Whittakers' existence, a sequence that repeats across generations. Children are born, families intermarry, traits and behaviors echo in time. Life continues in a closed system, untouched by outside morality, untouched by modernity, untouched by intervention. To an observer, it feels as though the mountains themselves have conspired to preserve this cycle, to enforce it with a quiet, unyielding hand. No one knows exactly how many of the original Whittakers remain. Some have left, though rarely, only to return. Some have passed, leaving their marks etched in the faces and behaviors of those who followed. And still, the hollow remains, a monument to choices made in darkness, to love hidden so completely that it became inseparable from horror. Visitors come and go, but the family endures, their lives a testament to a truth many cannot accept, that love, when twisted by isolation and fear, can become as destructive as any weapon. In the end, the story of the Whittakers forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. It challenges our notions of family, of loyalty, of morality. It exposes how easily love can be corrupted by circumstance, how deeply human beings can entangle themselves in cycles they neither fully understand nor can escape. And it reminds us, in the quietest and most disturbing way, that some truths are buried so deeply in the hills, in the blood, and in the hearts of those who lived them, that the rest of the world may never be ready to see them. They hid their love not out of shame, but out of necessity, and in doing so, they created something both tragic and mesmerizing, a living archive of humanity's most forbidden impulses. In the shadows of the Appalachian hills, they endure, their eyes watching, their hearts bound, their story unfolding quietly, relentlessly, as if to remind us that some secrets were never meant to be understood. only witnessed.